Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to welcome Nancy Mujo Baker Washi, our guest teacher this morning. Nancy is a Zen teacher in the White Plum Sangha. She is also a Dharma heir of Bernie Glassman and founded the No Traces Zendo or Sangha in New York City. She began Zen practice in 1979 with Nakajima Sensei, a Soto priest. Nancy is a native of Chicago who earned degrees at Wellesley College and Brandeis University. She's a professor of philosophy at Sarah Lawrence College. So I'd like to welcome Nancy and also the rest of your community who is joining us this morning.
Thank you, Helen. I'm very, very happy to be here. And also happy to be retired, which you didn't mention. So, as some of you may know, I know Helen knows because she read one of them, but I, by accident, ended up with some Dharma talks about the precepts being printed by Tricycle magazine. And this was a few years ago when I somehow came across one of them that had been transcribed. And then again, by accident, it's now turning into a book, which Shambhala will publish. And I think, well, I guess I should say right off that my master is Dogen. And the precepts that the 10 grave precepts and the 3 pure precepts that get studied in the lineage of Maizumi Roshi, and which your lineage is connected to, I know, or it's the 10 precepts that are studied and practiced. And so in addition to killing, lying, stealing, sexual misconduct, intoxication, which are the 5 that I think you are studying, there is not speaking ill of others' faults, not blaming and elevating oneself, not being stingy, not being angry, and not, and here there are many odd translations, not abusing the 3 treasures. What's interesting about the Dogen precepts, as they're called, that have come down to us, is that it's not a question of not or don't, but they come down to us as non-killing, non-lying, stealing, etc. And, you know, it's sort of quickly, and I think somewhat superficially, is presented to us as, was presented to us as sort of 3 ways of looking at the precepts. That one was the sort of absolute in the ordinary sense of absolute, never, ever, ever lie, steal, whatever. And the second was a sort of contextual, relative way that, you know, took into account that maybe Robin Hood's context made stealing okay. And then the third being the absolute, you know, somehow when you're in the absolute, there is no stealing, lying, killing, etc. Well, I don't know, that just wasn't satisfactory for this philosophy type. And so I've spent a lot of time really understanding Dogen and experientially and sort of philosophically. I mean, he was one of what I consider to be the 3 or 4 great philosopher mystics in the history of the universe. He said, when we sit zazen, what precept is not observed, what merit is not actualized? And of course, he didn't mean just sitting on the cushion, but rather the zazen that we take into life. And I thought the title of the book should be, we'll see what Shambhala says, but Opening to Oneness with the Zen Precepts. And so that, in the history of the religious traditions, oneness can mean many different things. And I think what's really striking about Dogen is that in the history of Zen, when we get to Dogen in the 13th century, it's suddenly the particulars of this world that we live in matter. I mean, he tells us that you want to know what Buddha nature is? Well, a horse's mouth and a donkey's jaw, raindrop, etc. But the oneness here, which includes other human beings and thus includes the precepts, is not just interconnectedness, but actually interpenetration. So it's as if one particular, and this comes out of the influence of something called Huayan Buddhism in him, for him. But it's that to become one with something, which happens in Zen retreats, the experience, it's actually to interpenetrate something, not to just mergy, mushy, disappear into whatever, but he points out that somehow that the absolute particularity of something, which then, to make this possible, it has to be not conceptual, so it has no boundaries. And that, so we find running throughout the Zen tradition that a goal, if you will, is to experience, to live non-hindrance or non-obstruction. So in the case of the precepts, I think the secret to understanding the precepts from his point of view is to study them along with his commentary and the commentary from Bodhidharma, whether it's actually, we know it's up in the air whether Bodhidharma actually existed, but they're called the one mind precepts of Bodhidharma. So when we practice the precepts at the beginning, at the level of not, I'm here and the precept is over there. And the precept is something that I observe or I follow or I fail to follow. So there's separation between me and the precept. So that's not, that's don't. But when we get to non, it's that whatever it is just doesn't happen. There's not even the temptation to lie or steal. How could what is there to steal if I am everything? Or if there's no particular me that experiences lack, why should I steal? There's no such thing. And this is very much like, I think, Augustine's love God and do what you will. That to truly love God is really the issue. And in Zen, to truly experience and know the oneness of being is truly the issue. So the separation, so I'm here and the precept is there, there's separation. And what I want is oneness. I want to be the precept. I want to become non-killing. But the other separation is between me and stealing, lying, being angry, gossiping, etc. So the only way to follow the precept is in some sense to suppress what the precept is urging us not to do. And so in doing that, I'm really sort of splitting off part of myself or disowning part of myself. And we know that, Zen practice urges us not to do that. I mean, when I do that, I end up being this particular bounded thing, aspect of myself that excludes other aspects of myself that I don't like. or are too painful to allow or befriend or have compassion for or become one with, to embrace, to welcome my anger, greed, my ignorance. Um, so the only way I can be one with a precept or with the glass of water that I have here and that I'm about to drink is by being 100% myself. It's a kind of samadhi state, a kind of, nothing is sort of excluded when that happens. And so there are two wonderful quotes from Dogen, which I'll read. But what I came to realize, and is very much part of how I have practiced the precepts with my group, is we learn to befriend all those aspects of ourselves that the precepts say are not good. First of all, they increase separation. They're not compassionate, so on and so forth. So we've developed a way of working with a partner or with a group where you answer questions like, tell me a way that you steal. And so it's to get to know the stealer, the thief in me, and then is bad enough to allow it that is what I am. But to actually be able to do that in the presence of others is very important, and it takes courage. But doing it has a remarkable effect. The closer, so take something like anger. Let's say I'm an angry person. This is the 9th precept. Say I'm an angry person, or I think of myself as being an angry person, or everybody else thinks of me as an angry person. It means that I'm easily triggered, reactive, and the anger gets out. It gets expressed, gets acted on. But the other side of that coin is some people stuff it. So they want, I'm not angry, not me, and the idea of being angry is really kind of scary. I have a wonderful friend who's my age, and years ago, when she was working a couple of hours away from New York City, and she was in analysis, and it involved a train commute, and she stayed overnight with me on Thursday night. So she had a session then, and then she had another session Friday morning, and then she'd take the train back. So years later, we were having Thanksgiving, and I said, Robbie, what was your analysis about? And she thought for a minute. She said, anger. And it doesn't strike me as an angry person at all, but I think it was the stuffing type. And I said, what about it? And she thought for a minute, and she said, I was afraid I'd blow up. Notice that language. It's like literally, existentially blow up. And there's an existential fear in that case of really being in touch with my anger. It isn't just that I'm afraid I'm going to blow up at my parents or whoever. So it does take courage in many cases to really allow these parts of ourselves that we would rather not deal with. But what happens when we do get curious, in this case, to stick with the example of anger, it's as if it either goes out or it goes in. I mean, it goes down, hidden in the basement, but it's right here that we should be interested. Be curious about what is it like, independently of the object of my anger, you, or the cause of my anger, you just broke my beautiful vase, but to be, what is anger? And to get closer and closer to that, it starts not having boundaries. It starts actually transforming itself. And, I think the Tantric Buddhism as practiced in Tibetan Buddhism with the Buddha families and so on, they have a language of the poison of anger is the poison. And the same energy, when the anger is released from my refusal, is clarity. And I've always been struck by sharp tongue, sharp mind. You can see it's a similar energy, but one is freed and one is still trapped. So here are the quotes from Dogen. And this is one that's occurred elsewhere in the Zen tradition, but he uses it in a particular way, which is not worth going into right now. It's too hard. He's very difficult, as I'm sure most of you know. If you fall down because of the ground, you must use the ground to get up. If you try to get up without the ground, it makes no sense. Namely, we have to use the stealer in us to arrive at the place of non-stealing. And here's the other wonderful quote. When a demon becomes a Buddha, namely, this is how it becomes a Buddha. It exerts its demonness, breaks it, and actualizes a Buddha. When a Buddha becomes a Buddha, and notice for him, Buddha nature is not something out there independent of us. It happens, you might say, when we experience it. So even a Buddha becomes a Buddha. Buddha nature is impermanent, and impermanence is Buddha nature for Dogen. So when a Buddha becomes a Buddha, he or she exerts his or her Buddhahood, strives for it, and actualizes a Buddha. When a human being becomes a Buddha, she exerts his or her human nature, trains it, and actualizes a Buddha. You should thoroughly understand the truth that possibilities for actualizing a Buddha lie precisely in the ways various human beings exert their respective natures. So in the case of stealing or anger, it's my being completely open to understanding it and discovering it, that in the case, the language with the demon, it breaks it, and there's a liberation that happens. And, it does take courage in the beginning, especially. And I found this wonderful anonymous quote recently that says, "The will of God will never take you to where the grace of God will not protect you." And I think that's where the role of faith happens in the Zen tradition. That we learn, it isn't that we have faith in this as opposed to that, it's, which is true, I think, in all traditions, that true faith is a question of a way of being. And it's when I open to what's painful, what's difficult, my teacher, Bernie Glassman, as I'm sure some of you know, would take people into true homelessness, have them experience what it's like to be homeless in winter, for example. And he had his retreats at Auschwitz, and so for him, he called these plunges, and it was about coming face to face, in this case not with parts of myself I don't want to deal with, but with parts of society, parts of human condition that I don't want to deal with. And somehow that coming face to face turns out to be liberating in a very surprising way, both about ourselves and about the world. I remember I did the retreat at Auschwitz, which is, he has a little book about it, which is wonderful read. And it's, 5-6 days of sitting on the selection site in November. It's cold, and the only lunch that we had was exactly what the inmates had. There was a little bit of thin soup and a piece of bread. And, and then you see these horrible things. I mean, then you hear, you go into the ovens and it's just, as my friend and Dharma holder, Kataiji, who's here somewhere, said when he came back, the mind can't take it in. But I remember leaving that retreat, and other people have had this experience, that every blade of grass was made of love. So it was so surprising. And this same thing happens when we really keep visiting these parts of ourselves that we don't like, that have, in this case, to do with the precepts. Now, in order to be 100%, allow 100%, welcome 100%, the liar, the stealer, etc. in me, I can't leave anything out. So one of the things that I did was to consider and welcome anybody studying the precepts to consider, take stealing, all the meanings that stealing could have. We usually think of it in some literal way as stealing other people's property, taking what's not ours. But think about stealing attention, or stealing electricity, or, when I remember when I was teaching at Sarah Lawrence, learning to flick the light switch off when I left the room. And I had to really learn it. I had to train myself. But then much later, thinking about the precepts, I thought, I'm just stealing from everybody else if I fail to do that, if I fail to pick up bottles and papers on my street, or if I harm the environment in some way. We now know that I'm literally harming Mother Earth. I'm harming Gaia that, has had for millennia the possibility of self-repair, but we may be pushing it beyond its capacity if we're not careful. But I remember in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't that I'm literally hurting the earth. It's that I'm hurting the beauty of something for other people, or I'm taking water from other people, or I'm cleaning water from other people, et cetera, et cetera. So that, so there are many ways of thinking about that kind of stealing. So I should have made a list of all the things I had thought of and that are in these essays, these talks. But, I think an important thing to do is to use your own imagination, because just spread it out, and lying, lying, unfortunately, we're living through a time in our own culture where lying is sort of so rampant, we've lost sight of what not lying is, or non-lying. But we lie to ourselves. We steal from ourselves. We steal health. It's amazing what you can do with these precepts. So it works. And eventually, because of that taking in, all just suddenly you start, especially working with a partner, what I've discovered, and everybody in the group has discovered, that even though in the beginning of starting to do this, take some courage, I have trouble acknowledging that I'm whatever. I'm certainly not going to do it in privacy. I'm certainly not going to do it in the presence of someone else. But it becomes very freeing. And the freer you become with something like that, the more naturally the precept expresses itself, as opposed to being something that I use to suppress or to control my behavior. So I'm opening it up to you all. So questions, comments, anything. And Helen, I'm not sure how to do this. Maybe you, people raise their hands, you can call on them.
First of all, Nancy, I'd like to thank you so much for being present to us today.
Who
I
is that?
this is Ruben Abito.
Ben,
I'm
I'm
sorry
so
I'm
happy
late.
to meet you.
I'm sorry I'm late. I had some school commitments, but I'm glad I made it. And I'd like to really thank you for taking time to share with us your wisdom. I feel that you have taken us to the heart of Zen itself in the way you described how to live the precepts in the light of that basic realization of non-separation between myself and the world, the universe.
Yes.
And I have been, so as you know, and as Helen told you, we have been studying the precepts in a methodical way. I hope we have been at least helpful to those who are joining, be able to understand it, not so much as a do's and don'ts kind of thing that precisely, as you said, separates us. If we see it in that way, then there's a part of me that wants to do this because I feel self-righteous in doing this, and if I don't, then I feel bad about myself and so on. So the precepts can be taken in a way that can really split us and be counter to what Zen is all about. And
Yeah.
what you then suggested is really to see that interpenetration between myself and everything else. And in that regard, the question is then how, really, it's a question of how to get to that place and how to lead people there without talking from that place as if it were in an elevated spot and then everybody just gazes at it in awe and not knowing what to make of it. So would you help us by offering some guidelines as to how you lead your students to that place that you just described? So we, especially for those, there are many who are beginning and they're really feeling attracted to this practice because they know that it's something that can really open them up and blow their minds. And so how would you lead people to that place that you described by the hand in entering the world that you described?
I'm glad you asked that because I think by the hand is really what it is. And I have come to see that, I remember Bernie used to say, we all know this, but then of course we say, well, I don't know this. But in the sense of having a glimpse of something in our daily lives. And the problem is that we pass over it. So there are these interesting moments like being moved to tears by something. And, I remember years ago reading that the biochemistry of those tears is different from the biochemistry of, anger tears or self-pity tears or whatever. And so what happens if I'm surprised, moved by something, but I quickly move beyond it to wonder what's done that. So there are two other examples that I think are excellent ones that I owe the recognition of this to Francis Lucille, who's a wonderful Advaita teacher. And one is getting a joke. That the very moment of getting the joke, we're not aware of at all. The laughter that follows it is really the thing. And then maybe even having to explain it to, what at that time I might consider a dense person, which I am sometimes, in not getting something. And the same with suddenly understanding something, that moment of suddenly seeing something. And what's happened then, and of course this comes, I think, closer to the Zen experience of realization, is that I have moved into another level, another realm, as it were. So instead of, we're always told you can't treat Zazen as a means to an end. You can't have a gaining idea. You can't look for the Buddha out there and so on and so forth, because it acts as a barrier. But the more I'm able to be this here, just sitting, whatever it is, working on a koan, something, um, giving up all, it's the grace of God. It suddenly happens to me. So we hear about this, we read about this and so on, but I think every beginner can just contemplate that experience of suddenly understanding something in ordinary life. I have a example that's very extreme in my life, ordinary life, which is I used to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I would, or even when I lived in New York, I would spend time on Cape Cod. And when I lived here, I would go for my March so-called spring break. And on Cape Cod, there's as some of you may know, there's a highway that goes out that at one place is one way both ways. So, and there's nothing really serious dividing these two ways. So there are these big signs that say, headlights on in daytime for safety. And I swear I spent 20 years wondering how the hell putting my headlights on is going to make me safer. And then one day it hit me. It was about the other guy being able to see my car. And I tell you, I laughed and laughed. I mean, it was a real Zen moment. So that's one way I think that one can take people by the hand. The other that I've really, and I, in a sense, I owe this to Bernie, but I think it came out of the academic in me as well, who taught in a small liberal arts college that was very oriented towards teaching and understanding the particular nature of each student instead of imposing some. And that is working with partners or working in group. And, Bernie and now many teachers in the White Plum Sangha use the Native American way of the council. And, to have a circle, and I've used it at the end of retreats where I will ask a question and there's a talking stick and the talking stick is passed around. And there's no crosstalk, and crosstalk includes even nodding and smiling, to somebody else. And it's sort of like the mind of Zazen, that there are these gaps, these moments, and then something comes up in the speaker. And then it goes on to the next person and so on. Well, this too, at first, is anxiety producing. And the real trick is not to rehearse. And so I think that somehow there's group work that Zen needs more of, because it helps break down those barriers that are always up, in promoting, self-promoting or self-protecting, and enable a kind of openness, a kind of relaxation that happens, so that even can happen with sitting. And then that too can increase one's focus. One isn't so distracted by. So I don't know, this is a woman teacher from a certain generation, but my academic life was in this college. I taught no more than 2 courses. They lasted a whole year, no more than 15 in a class, a round table, and each student had a one-on-one with the teacher every other week. So there was, at first, people are nervous, they want to show off or don't show off and so on. And as time goes on, the whole class just sort of opens up. And, actually, I for many years, I taught a course called Language and Religious Experience. And one of the books we read, which is a very difficult but extraordinary book, is by someone named Michael Sells. And it's called The Mystical Languages of Unsaying. And it's about the Western tradition, so that, the Zen tradition sort of goes vertically with the teacher and the student and becomes the teacher and so on. And the Western tradition is, a lot of it is in writing, and he shows how there's, you can't say, but you can't say that you can't say. So there's some way that reading disorients the mind. And so it sort of breaks open the possibility of the grace of God entering. And so I'm in this class one day, and the book is also written, I think, in this spirit. It's quite an extraordinary book. And something happened in the class. And I didn't, I just went right on. I mean, I don't think I even noticed it. But after that class, when I started having my one-on-one meetings with individual students, each one of them came in and said, "What happened in class?" And then I realized that something did happen. Namely, I allowed my own mind to go back and acknowledge. So it was a kind of group effort that made the whole group fall into a shared silence. And that kind of passing something over like that is no different from my passing over the moment of getting a joke. Mm-hmm. The moment of getting a joke is out of time. I can't grasp it conceptually. I can't describe it to you, but I can be aware that something like that happened.
Thank you. I think that that's a very important guide as to what Zen is all about. I'd like to open the floor for others, but one last comment just to affirm what you said, that Zen is not a methodical approach where you go and take a process and therefore you arrive at a conclusion, but simply a preparation for that aha moment when everything changes. And that's really what we're all about. When that happens, then we see the world in a totally different light. And as you said, the whole, every single blade of grass is just reeking of love. And I like that statement of yours.
Yes.
I'd like to open the floor now for other members to please feel free to raise questions or make comments related to Nancy's talk to us. The floor is now open.
So just one comment about what you just said, which is, it's learning how to be open all the time. And what happens then is that one's spouse or one's boss or one's job or it can always be new. So it's not, one is freed of the same old, and of course, living through COVID, we've all come very close to same old. Anyway, love to hear from any of you. Yes.
Yes, I would just like to make a comment. I'm Ruben's wife. My name is Maria. Yes. And I was very much touched by your talk also because I know Glassman Boshi, Bernie, and I have also been to Auschwitz, not with Bernie, but with another group of religious leaders. And it was the tears that you described, they certainly came, and the experience that every blade of grass is just luminous. But also when we went to the exit, they had these weeping willows. And I said, these trees are crying. And there was a nun with us who said, you are seeing that, not everybody does. Yes. And I think that is my question right now. We look at the world. Every blade of grass is filled with love, but also there is so much destruction going on right now. In this country, the political tensions, the racial tensions, now Israel, Palestine. A Jewish friend called me this morning and said, I'm so worried. My sister is in Tel Aviv and my brother is in Jerusalem. So when we have this realization that nothing is separate from us, yet how can we contribute to this world and even to this awareness? Because very easily she said, I cannot understand how there can be these Jewish extremists and all the things they are doing. And I think this is a very natural reaction to us. I cannot understand these people on the other side of politics and this initial oneness that we may experience with every blade of grass or the sky or the trees. Where does that go when we see so much destruction and suffering? Yes. How can we navigate that?
Yes. Well, I think one first step in navigating, which came to me many years ago, is to realize that our picture of the world comes through the news media. And that it is very much, this side and that side, and so on and so forth. And I remember years ago hearing about an organization of women, some of whom were pro-life, and some of whom and anti-abortion, and some of whom were pro-choice, as we call it. They worked together to help teenage girls, some of whom came from, say, Catholic background where an abortion was out of the question, some of whom didn't, or it depended on familial things and so on and so forth. So they helped these girls make a decision. But the fact that these women, the fact that this organization existed, and that these women work together and that they work for the good of others. Did you ever read about that in the news? And it should have been on the front page every day. And the same is true with the Palestine-Israel issue. I mean, there is a lot of good work that goes on between or with Palestinians and Israelis, and we never hear about it. Now, that is not a solution to what you're asking, but I do think it's a first step. And, if any of you ever decided to go help a situation of real polarization, I think the first step to take is to find out what's already existing, that has that interpenetration to a certain degree. Because when we try to, what do we do with polarization? You try to reason people out of it, but I think you need to find people who are already using their hearts and not their minds to try to solve these problems. And I'm, what I've said is a drop in the bucket, but you've asked a very big question. So thank you for all of us.
Chris Hawkins has a hand.
Yes, Chris.
Hi. First, want to say thank you for taking your time to share your understanding with us. I really appreciate it. You said a lot of things that resonated, so thank you. My question for you, I guess, is a bit more on the practical side. So I didn't realize that you're a philosophy professor, and I got my undergraduate in philosophy. And I've found in my Zen practice, there's always been a tension between Zen and like my philosophical nature, I guess. And I've had trouble resolving that tension and like marrying the two, to the point that I didn't even know if that was necessarily possible. I've always kind of felt it's got to be kind of one or the other.
Tell me what the tension is.
I feel like when I'm practicing Zazen, the philosophical part of my brain has to turn off.
How come?
Because if I'm trying to think about and figure something out, then I'm not being fully present with my experience.
Well, your experience could be trying to figure something out, and you could be fully present with that. And I'll tell you, the place you should go is Master Dogen.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'll also tell you an interesting thing. In the beginning of my practice with Bernie Glassman many, many years ago, there was another philosophy professor in the group who was politically very active. And he had a complaint about Zen, that somehow it wasn't solving the world's problems. And we did this, I can't remember the name of that public thing. Bernie stopped doing all of that after a number of years where, the master is there in his golden robes with his staff and it's a public thing. So people come up one by one and ask a question. And this man came up and did his bows and asked his question. And what Bernie said, I swear to God, I suddenly understood literally what the scales falling from one side means. Bernie said, there are no utopias. It's like cleaning. The job is never done once and for all. And I think that, it's, and in a sense, that's what objective or universal compassion is about. Because it has been freed of wanting to fix the world or fix a certain situation. And you can be sure that when the general theory of relativity came to Einstein after all his thinking, that thinking was a samadhi thinking. That was a zazen thinking. So I wouldn't make, as I said, I think the other great philosopher mystics were Plotinus and Meister Eckhart and Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi master. And they combined these two. And Dogen tells us, I think it's a mistake in thinking of Zen as being anti-language and anti-thinking, because it isn't. And Dogen is the one who, as a philosopher, really helps us understand that. Now, sitting zazen and thinking about a philosophical problem or any problem, that is a problem. I do not want my brain surgeon to be solving a philosophical problem when he's doing brain surgery. And when you're doing zazen, just do zazen. And when you're solving a philosophical problem, just solve a philosophical problem. And when you're eating, just eat. So Zen there's really no tension there. Just as I think my whole point is there's no tension between not stealing and stealing. You have to stop making them opposites that, once you can welcome something. So great, we could talk about this more. I'd love to if you're up for it.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. You got the philosopher going here.
Mary Jane Larrabee is another philosopher raising her hand.
Oh, good.
I really appreciate your talk. The one word I'm taking away is sort of opened something to me, and that's the interpenetration. And luckily you came back to it at the end. So I went, oh yeah, interpenetration. Because of course I've read Thich Nhat Hanh's Interbeing, and I like that, but you know what we do as philosophers. Oh, that's sort of maybe ontological, but I want the experiential.
Yes.
So I think that interpenetration gives me a pointer toward that.
Yes.
And particularly the two arrows meeting. And that's all I say. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, Thich Nhat Hanh emphasizes that other side of emptiness, which is that, the way I like to think of it is nothing is what it is except in its connection to everything else. And, I have a silly example, which is a saucer. Because I'm a language, Wittgenstein was my specialty. I'm a philosopher. So there's no such thing. There's no concept of saucer without cups, without liquid, without drinking, without peeing, without, all of this. And, Martians have this thing that looks just like our saucers. And they even have a word that sort of sounds like this. But it's not our saucer because there are no cups, they don't pee, they don't drink, so on. Somebody suggested they were flying saucers. So I think that so at that one level of seeing the interconnectedness of everything, it's what allows that is, to see the emptiness. You can always ask the question, well, what is empty? And the answer to the what is the suchness of something. And the suchness of something, just this, or just as it is, it's amazing. Philosophically speaking, where's our other philosopher? It was amazing to me because concepts were my thing. I really understood how they operated. But for something to have no interconnection with anything else, and at the same time to be exactly what it is that thing then is totally free to interpenetrate with anything else. And that's what happens with us in a Zen retreat. One can have the experience of, oh my God, I suddenly was one with the knife and the carrot, or the desk on the other side of the room, or something like that. And you realize that the being one with is a form of interpenetration. It's not a form of a kind of messy merging. So in one sense, the boundaries are gone, but the absolute particularity of whatever it is not gone. It just no longer has a name, and it no longer has boundaries.
Thank you again for that.
Well, you philosophers want to get together, just let me know.
Ruslan?
Beautiful talk. Thank you very much. I'm living in Boston, and I switch on my lights on that highway all the time.
Good.
In the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, there is a beautiful room where they put the 12th century sculpture of Maria Kannon on the left. And on the right, there is a Tibetan deity, which is pretty angry, actually, but very concentrated, of course. To me, it was always one. I have a question. Basically, we can cut out different pieces, of course, and we have a tendency to do that, like thinking and non-thinking and other things. I'm asking about the body. You mentioned energy. You mentioned opening. So, for example, Hakuin is one who was very strongly influenced by Taoism, by bodily experiences. So, how would you work with the body?
I really am. I have just spent a year just totally immersing myself in Dogen, and I think I need it also to make sense of my own experience. I tend to be the experience type, and so what? That's who I am. And there are two, it's Hee-Jin Kim's book about Dogen, A Mystical Realist, is really, takes us into the world of things, and it's philosophically very sophisticated book. But the other very interesting book is written by a Japanese philosopher who teaches at, I think at Loyola or Temple, I'm not sure which. And he has written a book called Attunement Through the Body. And it comes in 3 sections, and the middle section is about Dogen. And it is phenomenal. And it's really about the phenomenology of Zazen, of Shikantaza, basically. And he begins the book with a contemporary Japanese, Yasuo, I think is his name. And his work, I think the idea, first of all, is that the West tends to separate mind and body. And this thinker he's written a book apparently called Body as Spirit. And it's very interesting because this is our experience when the interpenetrating nature of reality, which includes us, starts experientially becoming clear. It's as if the body has become subject. But what happens in sitting is that the body is no longer an object. So it just, it's as if the subject that's self-conscious, that's aware, sort of falls back into the body. So this is all very esoteric, but then there is just all the body work that we human beings can benefit from. And of course, then, the sitting practice is about the body. And Dogen says it's the body that wakes up. It's the body that, it isn't, there's some Soto, there's an essay I read written by a Soto priest who said, Shikantaza is not meditation. So shikantaza, just sitting, Dogen's thing. And he says meditation is about, in a sense, working with mind. But zazen, and in its form, whether it's shikantaza or working with koans or breath or whatever, is really about the body-mind as one. So I'm not sure exactly what's behind your question. I know there are many more places we could go with this, but would you like to say some more?
No, thank you. These are good pointers. Thank you so much.
Good.
I have a question.
Yes,
Nancy.
Ellen.
Yeah, I think that Bernie Glassman, toward the end of his life, started clowning.
Yes.
And I was so happy to see that, because sometimes Zen is presented as a very bleak practice. I wonder how he taught by being a clown.
Well, actually, I just came across an interview with him about the clowning, and it's a link of, I can't remember exactly, but I think Adam can help me with this, and we will send it to you because he's talking about it. He would use one of these clip-on red noses, and he would do a lot of play on the words knows, who knows, Knows, and knows, and and come up with all kinds of Yogi Berra things, like, if you come to a fork in the road, take it, and things like this. So I think the idea was to get people to laugh, to relax, to realize that, all of this is not, if you remove laughter, getting a joke, there we have it. So I think the best thing is to let Bernie speak for himself. And so I'll send you this link. But I think also he did this with children, and that, that was fun for him and for them. And yeah.
Thank you.
And he created, by the way, the order of disorder. And so that was a subgroup of the Zen peacemakers. And so there's disorder. We've just heard about disorder everywhere in the world. Chaos, it's a mess. But, we have to welcome it. Sounds crazy, but we have to. We have to have hearts that are big enough to take it in. And our hearts are that big, and we have to discover that.
I think we have a minute for one last question. Anybody? Looks like nobody wants to ask the question. I'll ask the last question. You use koan study in your lineage, correct?
Koans?
Yes.
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 I personally don't teach koans, except for the two Dharma holders that I have, the two students who will let me retire someday.
Okay. The reason
but what's your question?
Yeah, my question was, what if a student has been on the koan move for quite a while, probably 5-10 years? How would you encourage that student to continue in the midst of all this frustration?
Well, I certainly would try to find out what the student wants from it. And I think really paying attention to the gaining idea. One of the great Soto Zen teachers in the 20th century was someone named Kodo Roshi. And he was very big on no gaining idea, which really comes from Dogen. Do not desire to become a Buddha. That's just becomes a barrier, because it takes away from the 100% of working on move, for example. And so Kodo Roshi said, really, he said, we don't eat in order to shit, and we don't shit in order to make manure. And, it's, I think, really working with the student to discover that in order to is important. And then, getting back into maybe ways of working with Mu that, are like, I don't know, on the breath and the big toe and the whatever, but to get away from trying to get something.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's helpful, but it's part of the journey. And it is, there is the focusing. I mean, I did myself work on koans, but not a lot. I mean, I didn't go through the whole system. And, I'm a focuser type, so that was good. And I am also a language type, so that it was easy for me in certain ways. But I think one of the hardest things is to just sit. So one of the things that I'm really working on is how Dogen's just sitting is a koan. It's a huge koan. And what it really has in common with working on a koan or with the whole koan tradition. So learning how to just do what one's doing, like the philosopher who's thinking while sitting, well, do them one at a time, and then eventually they get integrated.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
I'd like to thank you again, Nancy, for your sharing your wisdom with us. If I can get just one word to try to express what I feel was conveyed to all of us through your talk, is that Zazen is not a means or a method to get at something called enlightenment as an object, but it is precisely being what we are already, that infinite and boundless horizon that we are already in every sit, every standing up, every gesture. And as we continue with perseverance, somehow one day it'll hit us.
That's
By
right.
the grace of God or by the Dharma or whatever you may attribute it to, it just comes. So please hang in there. Everyone, you're on a path that is very life-changing and transforming. And Nancy has shown us that, yes, if you're really open, you're already there. Thank you so much. We're so grateful for your message.
Thank you. Thank you. So happy to meet you, Ruben.
Thank you.
Maybe someday in the flesh.
Right.
Hopefully.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. We'll visit you there somehow.
And I to you. So
You're always welcome, please. Thank you.
I have a very old childhood friend who lives in Austin, and I for years have promised to come and visit. So.
Oh, good. Visit us along the way.
Yes.
So Helen, please lead us for the chants.
Okay. The heart of the perfection of great wisdom sutra. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, practicing deep prajnaparamita, perceive the emptiness of all thy constituents and overcame all suffering. O Shariputra, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness
no other than form. Form is precisely emptiness. Emptiness precisely form. Sensation, thought, impulse, and consciousness are also like this. Oshari Putra, all things are manifestations of emptiness, not born, not destroyed, not saved, not pure, no gain, no loss, nothing, emptiness. There is no form, no sensation, no thought, no impulse, nor consciousness, no idea, no sound, body, mind, no color, sound, smell, taste, touch, thing, no realm of sight, no realm of consciousness, no ignorance, no ending to ignorance, no old age and death, no ceasing of old age and death, no suffering, no cause of suffering, no ending to suffering, no path, no wisdom, and no gain, thus no bodhisattvas live this prajna paramita, with no hindrance of mind, no hindrance, therefore no fear, are beyond all illusion. Nirvana is already here. All past, present, and future Buddhas live this prajna paramita and attain supreme perfect enlightenment. Therefore, know that prajna paramita is the great mantra, the great right mantra, the supreme mantra, the unsurpassable mantra, by which all suffering is wiped away. This is the truth without deception. Therefore, set forth this prajna paramita mantra. Set forth this mantra and proclaim Kate, Kate, Parasate, Parasamgate, Bodhisattva, Prajna Paramita Sutra.
The four vows of the Bodhisattva.
Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. The darkness are boundless. I vow to enter them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. The dark gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. The dark gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Oh, Buddhas, space and time. Oh, Brahmins, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maharashtra Paramita.
Thank you again. Helen, announcements?
Thank you again, Nancy, for coming to our virtual.
Thank you, Helen, for finding that peace and asking me to come. This has been a real pleasure.
You can come again.
I would love to.